the opposite to addiction is connection. So I think, community, identification, connection, and I mean like legitimate connection, not just a well-meaning relative on the sideline telling you to make better choices. I mean like somebody who, may have been there or has, the skills to, hold a space that is deeply compassionate, and kind. And I mean, can I tell you about how I got clean?
Yeah,
it'd be great to hear that. Yeah.
I guess I'd probably say it's like the beginning of the end. And I was about 21. I was in a police station in Brighton. I'd been nicking DVD box sets. It wasn't glamorous or organised crime. Very sort of, an expression of someone who's addicted to drugs and out of control. I got arrested, and I was in the police station. I was sat with this solicitor who told me that she used to have a gin problem but doesn't drink anymore. And I remember thinking, that sounds like a really fucking nice problem. I'm a smackhead, but she was middle class.
Yeah.
And I remember she spoke to me with really kind and warm, endearing language, and she used words like sweetheart, love, and darling, and she would ask questions and then pause and just listen, and, pretty sort of standard stuff, but stuff that I hadn't really come up against for a while because, I was, probably not that approachable. And she just said to me, Ian, sweetheart, why are you living like this? And I just knew that it was safe to be honest. And normally, like, the bullshit would just flow out of my mouth. Well, that would probably represent a series of like justifications, minimizations, rationalizations, strongly connected to the mechanism of denial, that psychological coping strategy designed to keep us emotionally stable in unstable times, and it's a very powerful, construct for the addicted person and often prevents them from, getting into recovery or moving towards truth. And I just, for some reason, this sense of care and compassion and kindness and her showing up as a human being just kind of bypassed that stuff. And I just remember looking at her thinking, I can be honest here, and I took a deep breath, sat back in my chair, and I just said, I don't want to live like this anymore. And it was the most honest thing I'd ever said to anyone in my life. It just came from the most honest part of me. And that was the beginning of the end, really, and I think she did it unwittingly. I don't think it was a thought out structured intervention she was trying to achieve. I think she just was a really caring, kind person. And I've heard Gabor Mate's quote, as one teacher says, that when compassion is present, then can we see the truth? And I think we have to kind of manufacture, conversations and environments and conditions that, are non-threatening, that are caring, compassionate, understanding, insightful. And often I think the ego, constructs itself in a way to protect the behavior that you feel is helping you. And you want to preserve that, and it's, and your perspective is limited, and, obviously you're in a lot of denial and you're concealing your own personal truth, but you want to protect what you think's helping you, right?
That's really encouraging. Yeah. I mean, that's really encouraging, isn't it, Rich, to hear that one person, a helper, somebody in a helping profession that might have been there doing something different or taking a different position with you had offered that gift of trying to understand or being open to having a conversation with compassion. And that was something that was came at the right time for you, and that was useful.
What social workers could do, essentially, which is to recognise that there's going to be a level of denial often with substance misuse, especially if it's serving as a self-protective kind of coping mechanism, which much of what we've talked about today highlights that it is. And then secondly, what that solicitor was able to convey, I think, was seeing Ian as a person and not necessarily as an addict. She didn't define him by his addiction to a particular substance. And sometimes we're able to do that, and sometimes we're not able to do that. But I think part of it begins with there's two things really. One is an introspective relationship with oneself, where you recognise that addiction to substances is just one mechanism and one means by which people avoid dealing with being with the self, and it's one of the mechanisms which receives a lot of social disdain or legal consequences. But I think many of us should be able to relate to the idea of being on, using social media too much, or eating too much food, or working too much, or whatever your kind of particular vice might be, smoking, etc. And a lot of these are ways of us trying to avoid being with oneself. And if you can recognize that within yourself, then in theory you should be able to generate a level of empathy for the parent who's using a substance, because it's just a more extreme version of that, essentially. And then secondly, another way of thinking about how to generate compassion is, like I mentioned a minute ago, looking beyond the kind of surface behaviour. There's a quote by Mate, and I'll just read that out here, because I think it points to the challenge of working with individuals who misuse substances. He writes, "They lurk on the social periphery as hardened men with ravaged faces, as thieves, robbers, shoplifters, as done-up prostitutes, selling backseat sets for drugs or petty cash, as street corner drug pushers or small-time entrepreneurs distributing cocaine. Scruffy and dirty, shifty and manipulative, they invite distaste. Fearful and contemptuous of authority at the same time, they evoke hostility." So I think I don't want to make out like working with parents or being around somebody with an addiction and generating a level of compassion is straightforward, because they'll often engage in behaviours that are harmful to themselves, to the people around them, to you as somebody that's trying to help them. But I do think the greater understanding that we can have about how the substance is often serving them, the more likely we are able to get to a place where that solicitor was able to, for Ian, for example.
So I kind of feel that the choice to do certain behaviours are the choices that we all make, but the conditions in which you end up in are more to do with the predisposition that you have that are going to that hold a strong chance of taking you there. And I'd probably say that's why drugs aren't addictive. That's one of the biggest myths, right? Because if drugs were addictive, one who took a drug would be a drug addict. So we have to ask ourselves, why are some individuals susceptible to addiction and some aren't? And for me, the answer lies in trauma.
I've always believed that people fundamentally want to live sort of happy, fulfilling, rewarding lives. And so when people are engaging in behaviours that seem counterintuitive to that or self-destructive in some shape or form, I suppose I've always been quite curious about what they believe that they're getting out of the behaviour, even if the behaviour seems to me self-evidently quite self-destructive. And part of my thinking here was influenced by growing up with my dad, who was also a care leaver, although never used that label or identified with it particularly. But he abused. He was addicted to everything. He'd take anything really: heroin, opiates, Valium, diazepam, prescribed and unprescribed cannabis, alcohol. And so my experience with him, I suppose, led me to never conflate someone's behaviour with their intrinsic worth. And so then when I started working with parents who were using substances in a way that was problematic for them or having an impact on their children, I was always curious about what they felt like the benefit was for them of taking the substance. What one of the examples, for example, when I worked with a parent who misused heroin, they would describe it as I just feel like it's a nice, warm internal hug. And so they're talking about that the substance offering them a degree of comfort and emotional reassurance. And so then you have to ask the question about what is it about their life situation or their circumstances that they feel like they're unable to access that meaningfully in any other area or any other place apart from taking this particular substance. And so for a lot of parents, the substance, as Ian was just alluding to, really was a solution for them to deal with their unbearable psychological distress, often associated with some of their experiences. And it was the most effective solution. That's the problem with drugs and alcohol, is that in some ways they're really good at what they're designed to do. But, you know, you carry that addiction forward several years later when you've got children and it's beginning to interfere in ways that are problematic.
And everybody, you know, would say that when they first took heroin, it was like a warm, soft hug, a warm, soft blanket. And everybody had a story of separation, loss, abandonment, rejection, you know, neglect in their childhoods. So I guess the difference between them and maybe some of their peers was the release from that, you know, when they engaged in that behavior or that substance, kind of just made them so much more vulnerable to going back there, to keep going back, you know. And I think that, yeah, my experiences and observations really align to that. I don't know how relevant this is, but it's the power of addiction. Even today, when if I had to go for a blood test, when they put the needle in my arm, I feel this sort of like tingle up the back of my spine, and I can taste heroin in the back of my throat, and then like nothing. And like, that's just because they've put a pin in my arm to draw blood out. No, and it's like it's psychosomatic that the brain, you know, like the brain is hardwired to go, you're going to get that warm hug, you're going to get that safety, you know, and then I just feel like angry that they kind of gave me a glimpse of heaven but wouldn't let me dwell there. You know, it's a powerful thing, you know, addiction, once you've been into that place.
And so we've talked about how drug addiction or alcoholism isn't necessarily your choice. Or it is a choice within the confines of a very limited range of choices to deal with often very difficult, unbearable feelings. And we've also talked about how drugs in of themselves aren't necessarily addictive. Because if drugs were addictive, then everybody that took a drug would become addicted, and the vast majority of people don't become addicted. And then in terms of like supporting or helping people overcome addiction, what were some of the kind of key elements, Ian, in your personal journey that facilitated your recovery?
Yeah, I think for me, the most encouraging thing was joining a community of men and women, you know, who kind of were on that path together. And there was a lot of power in, you know, attending recovery support groups in the community. You know, it kind of, and I like, you know, the word community because it kind of refers to common unity.